you, Emily, and welcome. We have Dr. Helen Wiersma-Koch. Dr. Helen Wiersma-Koch joined Indian River State College in 2015. She's an assistant professor in our biology department and has a specialty in protein evaluation. Dr. Koch earned her PhD in biochemistry from Stanford University in 2013. Prior to joining IRSE, Dr. Koch worked in the public school system. She has completed the AQ course in effective teaching practices and the micro-credential in creating an inclusive and supportive online learning environment. She regularly uses strategies from these courses in her face-to-face and online courses. Welcome, Helen, and thank you for joining us.
I can't hear her. Is anybody else having problems with sound?
My mute button was on. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Such a common
It happens every time. So I'll start again. About 2 years ago, I took the AQ credential course on effective college teaching practices. And the most impactful modules for me were the ones on writing learning outcomes, aligning learning outcomes to assessments, and aligning learning outcomes to activity. It was so transformative for me that I started rewriting, realigning all of my learning outcomes for all of my courses. And it has really made a huge difference in how I teach and how my students are mastering these learning outcomes. So tonight I'm going to tell you about my process. So I'm just going to get some definitions out of the way. LLOs, these are the lesson level learning outcomes. This is what I want students to take away from each lecture and each activity. So it really guides students and helps them center in on what they should focus on while I'm lecturing, while we're doing these class activities. These LLOs build toward the module level learning outcomes. So these are overarching ideas and skills students should learn in each multi-chapter module. And so I structure my unit exams around these MLOs, and I actually write my study guides using using the structure of these MLOs. And then course level learning outcomes, I'm sure we're all familiar with. It's those learning outcomes that go on our syllabus. It's the learning outcomes that have to go get approved by curriculum committee, all of this stuff. I view it as a contract with my students. Get through the course, and these are the skills you will leave with, and this is the knowledge you will have gained. Now, these learning outcomes all build on each other. The lesson learning outcomes are really the foundation. These are the small pieces of knowledge and skills that my students need to have. Then these lesson learning outcomes build to the module level outcomes, and then the module level outcomes build to the course level learning outcomes. Something I'm not going to talk about today, but I need you to keep in mind is that you need to be supporting your program learning outcomes with these CLOs, with these course level outcomes, to make sure your course is fitting into the program you teach. So, how do we write learning outcomes? I'm on the curriculum committee, and as Jody was saying, we get a lot of learning outcomes that are students will understand, students will know, students will learn. And yeah, most of our time in the curriculum committee is spent revising those. So a learning outcome should be student-centered, demonstrable, and specific. As appropriate, it should also include higher order thinking. Okay, so below I have a learning outcome for my biochemistry course. So let's dissect this learning outcome and see where all of these pieces fit in. So to make something student-centered, very easy, start it with students will. to be demonstrable, you have to use these action verbs. What will students be doing and what will you be observing? So they're going to evaluate and they're going to dissect. Also, students should be able to read a learning outcome and know what they're supposed to do. So that's the specific part. So my students read this learning outcome and know that they're going to be participating in discussions, written and oral discussions. This is a 4,000 level course. So of course, we don't want our learning outcomes to be centered in remember and understand. A couple can be, but most of our learning outcomes want to be at the levels of apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And evaluate and dissect fit those level 4 and 5 learning outcomes. So why did I do this? Because I was convinced by the AQ class that these learning outcomes provide students with clear expectations. What are they going to do in each class meeting? What are they expected to do on each unit exam, each project, and each final exam? By providing these clear expectations, we increase the transparency in the course. So nothing is a mystery, nothing is hidden from the students. Students know that, for example, for a unit exam, they know that if they can explain, analyze, evaluate each lesson level and learning outcome, then they're going to ace the exam. Also, we all have our favorite stories to tell and examples to use. By having things structured very clearly on what I want my students to know and be able to do, this keeps me focused on topics and activities that align with these outcomes and keeps me from getting off track. So in a remote environment, I'm using it very similarly to how I'm using it in a face-to-face environment. The CLOs are in the syllabus and very prominently displayed on the MLS, and each course activity is aligned to at least one of those CLOs. Throughout the semester, I actually have students reflect on their progress toward these CLOs. When I was in the public school system in St. Lucie County, we had scales and we had mastery of scales. It was a 1 to 4 scale. And we had to assess, get students to self-assess where they fell on the scale. I do something very similarly to that with my course learning outcomes, is self-reflection. MLOs are included at the top of every module, and study guides and module exams are organized around these MLOs. LLOs, before I start a section in lecture, we go through the learning outcomes. This helps preview the topics for students. And then at the end of each section, I give a formative assessment, a couple of quiz questions that directly align to these learning outcomes. So this is an example of how I aligned learning outcomes with course assessments. And it's just a course map that I made that included in the syllabus so that students can see exactly where each learning outcome is being assessed and how it's being assessed. So discussions, which I'll talk about at the end, really assess and hit on each one of these course learning outcomes. So my learners are every student that comes through my classes. All of my non-majors, all of my AA students, all of my BS students, in each lecture and lab that I teach. This is really something that can be implemented in all levels of classes. So how do I implement it? Again, like I mentioned before, those LLOs, I have formative assessments after each section. MLOs, again, the study guides are organized around them. And on the unit exams, I tag each question with an MLO number. And in the CLOs, I made that course map. I've incorporated CLOs into each project and assignment, and I tag final exam questions with the CLO numbers. So now I'm going to talk about specifically how this has impacted my discussions. So when I first started teaching, I was moving from K-12 system to college, and I had these high aspirations that we would be reading primary literature in the field and discussing it, and it was going to be great because we could really delve deep into it. And it didn't quite work out. Students weren't reading the papers, they weren't participating in the in-class discussions, and it really devolved into me explaining each figure to them, each question to them. So I gave up on the literature discussions for a while, and that was heartbreaking. But then I took the AQ course, and I redesigned my discussions to increase transparency and relevancy to students and increase student engagement. So first, I did topic alignment. I chose papers, I chose scientific literature that was directly relevant to the LLOs, MLOs, and CLOs for that module. We have an entire chapter in biochemistry about hemoglobin and cooperativity. So I chose several papers, several seminal papers that explained and went through the experiments about how that cooperativity was actually discovered. So students were getting the background in lecture, and then we were diving deeper in these discussions. I designed transparent assignments. I included the MLOs at the top of the discussion so students knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing and what I was asking of them. I also provided a rubric to the students that was aligned with the mastery of the MLOs. So this really increased the transparency again, so students knew exactly what I was being asked about them. And then finally, I required students to complete 10 aligned discussion questions prior to any synchronous online meeting or in-class discussion we had. So students were prepping for these discussions beforehand. I wasn't just leaving it up to the honor system on whether they're going to read these papers. So this is an example of a little bit of what one discussion looks like. So I have the learning outcomes first and foremost, what the students are going to learn and what they're going to do. I have the assignment overview. I have the papers they're going to read. Not shown are the questions they have to answer aligned to the module learning outcomes. And then I also have a rubric not shown that also aligns each question to that mastery of those learning outcomes. So what have I learned? So taking on this Herculean task of rewriting and aligning all of my learning outcomes, I've really had to evaluate what is very important for my students to learn. And I really embrace this idea of backwards design, starting from the program learning outcomes and asking how my course supports these program courses, and then building down from the program to the course, to the module, to the lecture learning outcomes. And what this has done that I've found is that it creates clear goals and expectations for students. I've also had to take a hard look at my in-class activities, my projects, my discussions, and whether or not they support my learning outcomes. Again, transparency. And there were a couple pet projects that I had students complete that I could just not justify after looking at my learning outcomes, that I could just not justify keeping in the course. And it broke my heart to have to majorly redesign those projects, but I redesigned them. One of them I eliminated, so we no longer do that. I replaced it with something else. So really, if you do this work, you really have to take a hard look at what you're doing, and you're making sure it's supporting these learning outcomes. And then the discussions, increasing the alignment and transparency really increased my student buy-in. They were doing the discussions, they were reading the literature, they were reading extra papers that I didn't even ask them to read. I mean, how cool is that? And it really resulted, now we have robust discussions in my class. There's none of these silent, awkward moments, and it really increased my participation.
Thank you, Helen. That was very impressive. And if you take a look at the chat, you'll see that others are impressed as well. And you used the word Herculean. I think that it's a good choice. So one of the questions speaks to that. It says, this is incredibly impressive. How long did it take you to complete the process for all of your courses? How did you approach the task? And I'm going to throw an add-on there to ask if you had any help with it.
Okay. So it took me, I did 2 classes a semester. And it really took me the entire semester. I revised for the next semester as I was moving through the course material that semester. So as I was moving through the course material, I would be writing my lesson learning outcomes, module learning outcomes, and doing all of that work. So it was, but it has made such a difference in my classes. I told my class tonight that, oh, we're gonna have to end early because I have a presentation I have to give. And they're like, oh, what's it on? And I kind of laughed and I said, learning outcomes. And they're like, you know, you are the only teacher that does that for us. And I was kind of sad, but you know, and I did not have help, but I am now the learning outcomes coordinator for my department. So, you know, now I help everyone
from that.
everyone else do this work.
Good.
Yeah.
Great way to give back in addition to teaching. Okay, you mentioned that you put the outcomes on your assignments. Do you talk to your students about them?
Yes, we talk about them. We look at the assignment and the rubric paired together. And so if it's an online course, I do a video about it. If it's a synchronous or in-person course, we go through it in class, and we really talk about how this is going to get them to master those course learning outcomes.
And looks like it's the last one. If anybody else has a question, pop it in there and we'll make sure we get it to Helen. Now that you have made these changes and made the course more transparent, have you noticed a decrease in the number of questions you receive from students? And it vanishes. Great job, Helen.
Absolutely. So I think everyone dreads the, when are we ever going to need this question? You know, and I used to get that a lot. I used to get lots of complaints about why we're covering photosynthesis, why we're ever going to need it, like all of this stuff. And now by doing that transparent design, students see clearly that even though they might not ever need to recall the roles of the photosystems, they're going to need to be able to dissect that literature or learn the skills to analyze literature and stuff like that. So I don't get that annoying question anymore.